Hi, welcome to this session on humanitarian action, humanitarian system, and actors. And then we also look at the process of humanitarian response. In other words, the humanitarian cycle, response cycle. Yeah, so we intend to understand the nature of humanitarian system and explore some of the different actors within and outside the humanitarian system, and then we also discuss the humanitarian action process. So we have many, just as we talked about in the overview of humanitarian situations, we saw there are diverse humanitarian situations, and they are complex in a way, and some of them are attended to, others are not, others are reported, others are not, because of many factors. And of course, even if they are complex and diverse, that itself does not mean that they do not have to be addressed. The humanitarian situations therefore create a need for some kind of universal action to be able to promote human rights and well-being of everyone, everywhere, and at any time. So therefore, in that case, different actors would collaboratively act together in coordinated kind of networks to manage the flow of humanitarian response and resources and so on. And that makes it a network of humanitarian system. However complex it is indeed active, and it is helpful in making sure that all human beings are attended to be able to live well wherever they are anytime. So again, just a reminder, assistance is given to the humanitarian assistance or protection advocacy is given to save lives, to reduce suffering in a short term, but of course sometimes in a long run, as a result of this short term outcomes, long term outcomes of recovery and reconstruction can be also um, uh, realized at a later stage. But also, humanitarian action is done to preserve people's dignity and human rights, of course, but also open the way to recovery and durable solutions to displacement, and therefore to be able to help people everywhere to settle and regain their livelihoods. So assistance, again, we say it could be in terms of food, medical supplies, clothing, shelter, seeds for agricultural tools, and the rest. Of course, for instance, most of you who work in humanitarian in refugee settlements, you know what we mean by these supplies and assistances, especially if you go to northern Uganda and South Sudan. These are the things that happen almost every day. You have a network of different NGOs and government and international donors and others that come in to mobilize resources and to help the situation. Okay, so again, non-political, non-commercial, non-military, but just to save lives and alleviate suffering. Okay. Of course, while we say that humanitarian assistance and aid or response may qualify as development assistance, it differs in terms of how and when and for whom it is done. So don't confuse the two. Although the other one can be a subset, humanitarian assistance can be a subset of development assistance. Okay. So, 2021 report of global humanitarian overview states that, of course, 235 million needed assistance, in this year of 2021, they need assistance. People, I mean, 160 million have been targeted. The requirements is $35 billion, and of course you have also appeals in the process. Then you have, of course, people reached with humanitarian aid in 2020. If you look at the previous year, you have um, uh, 98 million were reached in 25 countries, and 70% of the targeted population were able to be reached. So you can see that even when there is humanitarian action, it does not actually end up helping everyone, but at least something is done. Okay, and of course, at a later stage, when we get to the evaluation of humanitarian action, then we can get to look at why some can why some results are achieved while others are not achieved. Okay, so where does the international humanitarian response go? These are, for instance, in 2020, these were the largest recipients of the humanitarian assistance. Syria, then followed by Yemen. You have Lebanon, South Sudan, and DRC. Of course, these are some of the top countries that are experiencing humanitarian crisis and therefore require big chunks of funding to help the situation. How does it get there? Of course, through governments. You can see also through private yeah, so you can see you have private funding here, you have government funding here by OECD and so on. Then you have others. Then they flow through public sector, which is always the government, of course. And then you have NGOs. Of course, they receive some big amount because they are more active in terms of getting close to communities that are suffering. Then again, private also funds through NGOs, through donations and so on. And then they get through, of course, Red Cross and Red Cross Crescent, and you can see it gets into multilateral organizations, and then at that level, then at the bottom you have recipients. It could be communities, could be countries, and so on, where the situation is happening. So you have, of course, what does it do? I mean, the humanitarian, of course, the humanitarian funding, of course, it is injected in two programs, including those that are for food, agriculture, housing, education, empowerment, and capacity building. For instance, issues to do with gender and so on, health, clothing, agriculture, social enterprises, and so on. But of course, also the general resettlement programs, especially where you have immediate responses that must be, of course, that have to be addressed. So others could go through social protection interventions such as cash transfers and vouchers to help the situation. Okay. And of course, within those the process of finding the money, if it go through that or that process, and then for these all these projects or programs, they require some actors at all levels. The actors can be at community level, household level, national or international level. So you have a whole range of network of organizations, institutions, agencies, local, national, international level agencies that work together in an impartial way to be able to provide humanitarian action. So all operate in a network, which can be looked at as a humanitarian system, but also all operate within a framework of humanitarian principle. So we are going to look at this in a moment. So you have a range of actors, including donors, UN agencies, international NGOs, local NGOs, private sector, media, and academia that do research and so on. You have host communities and local authorities, government agencies, and then, of course, at the center, we have the affected people or the beneficiaries of those humanitarian interventions and actions. Okay, so you have the humanitarian system, which Knox Clark defines as the network of interconnected institutional and operational entities that receive funds, as we have seen above, how the fund was flowing, directly or indirectly from public donors and private sources, as we have seen. So you can see just right here, this is what I mean, how funding flows. So private and government, okay. And to enhance, support, or substitute for in-country responses in the provision of humanitarian assistance and protection to a population in a crisis. So again, it's a complex system because it is made of interrelated parts determining own actions. It is open and interacts with outside systems that influence how it does its work. For instance, you have private sector influence or and other organizations influence how government responds to some actions, for instance, in refugee settlements and so on. But also it's non-linear. The system is non-linear. It's all over, those all connections, as we shall see in a moment. And it is emergent because it happens anytime. Response happens anytime. Crises happen anytime, anywhere. So there can't be any kind of planned. Now, of course, we can say there is preparedness for response. Yes, but you can't know the magnitude of how things are going to be, and therefore, even when there is preparation, there are other conditions that come up within the crisis itself or in the process of preparation to respond. So again, from state, you have UN agencies or international and national actors, and then to communities or individuals that are affected. So a whole range of informal and formal actors, okay, and actions. So this is how complex the humanitarian system is, and so you have the affected communities in the middle here, which are connected to donors through government agencies and trusts. Then you have the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement, and then you have groups in the diaspora also who support. You have development actors, a range of them. Then you have militaries and civil defense groups that coming in a situation to protect and serve. For instance, you saw how the US was sending servicemen also, who even some of them died trying to save the situation at Kabul airport of recent. Then you have international NGOs, and then you also have the UN international agencies. You have academics, you have media, you have national NGOs, civil society organizations, private sector, and then government itself, the host government, and then the humanitarian arms of regional intergovernmental organizations. So a whole system which is interconnected, working together to make sure that the affected communities just right in the middle are responded to. And then you have, of course, I've talked about all these, that the humanitarian system is comprised of all those organizations, just as we have just looked at them. Of course, the humanitarian system also act is influenced by other entities, including national militaries, as we have seen above, the private sector, the development actors, the civil society organizations, and so on. So, for instance, the media reports how the situations are, and therefore the reports influence what decisions other agencies and humanitarian actors can do. The academia, for instance, does research, and research influences decision making, and so on. Civil society organizations can act in terms of advocacy, and also participate in mobilization of resources, and so on. So you have a whole range of actors that are within the system. Okay, then of course we are going to do this in class, where you try out some kind of put yourself in a context of a refugee, make a list of all actors who play a role, positive or negative, in the refugee assistance and protection. Arrange all the actors on a flip chart and or board to make an actor map that shows the respective roles of actors and links between them. So you can use the markers to add text and connecting lines if necessary. And then, of course, how do you like the map to look like? Use different colors to indicate those potential protection providers that are not currently activated, so that we can see how they can come in to influence whatever situation that is at hand. Okay, so we shall do this in our discussion. So we earlier on talked about the humanitarian principles. So you have that humanitarian assistance should be the humanitarian actors must not take sides in hostilities or engage in controversies of political, racial, or religious, or they should carry out their action on the basis of need alone, giving priority to the most urgent cases, and therefore that relates to impartiality, but also must be autonomous and independent from political influence. But of course, we know all these things sometimes when we get the real life situations, these things are not in most cases practiced, especially when it comes to humanitarian action that must be independent. But of course, also it must be characterized by humanity. Okay, addressing any situation wherever it is found, to be able to help everyone. So you have the humanitarian action in process, and this can, of course, reflect to humanitarian response cycle. So you have prevention, which is followed by mitigation, which is followed by preparedness. Because preparedness can always be there for all the situations, because sometimes even when you are implementing already, the situation escalates. Therefore, you must be prepared for that. You have disaster and crisis. It happens, although you had done prevention mechanisms to prevent floods from happening, then also you put measures that if it happens, you mitigate the impact, and then you prepare for if it happens. So now that it happens, then you can respond, and then you recover, and then we can participate in the reconstruction of those communities. Okay, so this is how the cycle looks like. So you have needs assessment and situation analysis, and then you have strategic planning, because now you know what, for instance, people that are affected by the crisis need. Then you mobilize resources according to what you have analyzed, and then you implement according to the resources you have mobilized and according to the needs, and then you implement and then do evaluation. So for this particular module, we are going to concentrate on evaluation. Okay, so we assume these have happened, and then we can look at how evaluation of humanitarian response or action can be done. As I had said earlier, you can see preparedness is always everywhere, because you never know how the situation will happen, whether it will escalate, or whether it will bring in other new crises within the crisis. As we said earlier, that humanitarian situations can be complex, because one of the characteristics is that crises can come in within crisis. It's a conflict, it's a refugees are happening, displacement, and then you have famine, and then you have droughts, and so all sorts of things. So at the center there, you have coordination between different actors, and then information management systems that would help in the flow of data. Of course, these coordinations and information management would later on influence how evaluation would be done. Okay, so just to have an overview of the cycle. So just visit this link. I have provided this short video in your Moodle. You can take a look at it, and Chris Daly really gives how an example of an explanation how they applied the humanitarian response cycle in their interventions of different different humanitarian situations. So please visit it and see how a further explanation of a real example on how humanitarian crisis or humanitarian response cycle works. So you have needs assessment, planning, resource mobilization, implementation, and evaluation. But of course, preparedness is always at the center. So what happens during preparedness? Of course, preparedness is endless, cross-cutting all other cycle steps, as we have seen above. So an essential factor for success for any humanitarian response, because at least you get to know what is needed, who needs what, and when, and how, and why. Okay, so in that case, you can be able to plan well. It's continuous planning and resource mobilization. Does not necessarily need to wait for crisis to happen. You need to be prepared anytime. And then, of course, you analyze, you do, you assess what is needed. So you have joint stakeholder assessments to identify the needs of the affected people, and then you have document agreed priority. Then you document that according to the joint stakeholders. Then you do corrective analysis of what is needed. Then you plan to see what the aim of the response would be and how it will be achieved. So consider now, for instance, when we are looking at the usual projects, consider baseline versus impact or outcomes that you want to achieve. Okay, so establish implementation boundaries, because you cannot cover everything. Okay, if you look at the UN cluster approach, so you have health, education, and so on, hygiene, and so on. So which one do you want to focus on? So you have to plan. You define intended activities and inputs. You identify stakeholders, and if you remember stakeholder analysis, and then see who is aligned to specific activities and the response that you want to put across. Following that, you have to then you mobilize resources and allocate them according to different, of course, different situations. Earlier on, we saw how resources were mobilized and how funding was flowing through different actors, especially NGOs, to see that the funding gets to the recipients. So what resources are needed and where do we get them from? Is it from the UN agencies? It's from the countries, multilateral agencies, and other donors? Is it collective kind of resource provision and mobilization done by a network of different actors? Then, of course, you continue lobbying for more resources as you implement, because sometimes we have humanitarian situations that are emerging, so you can't first sit to do this, so you can keep mobilizing resources as you are also acting. That is why preparedness is all over, so that you know anytime anything can happen. So when you have your funds, you have your resources, then you can now implement according to what you had planned. Of course, again, So complex situations, even when we are planned, we must be flexible because situations keep changing. So you have continuous assessment of response, which is monitoring in that case, and then you identify if humanitarian communities have responded according to the plans, or if not, why and what should be done to address those challenges. And then lastly, you evaluate. Are we achieving, or did we achieve what we intended to do? So formative or summative evaluation, and looking at what did we use, what did we achieve, is it according to what we wanted to achieve also. So it's very important. So this is our focus for this module, evaluation, looking at how can we effectively evaluate humanitarian action. Some key issues to consider during implementation: humanitarian principles, human rights, intersectionality, race, gender, and so on, so that you can apply those principles. And of course, towards early recovery and involving all stakeholders. Note that you must be flexible, and the situation of implementation is iterative, because no one size fits all. Situations change, and whatever apply. If your project on education with to deal with refugees works well in Afghanistan, it does not mean it will work well in with the Rohingya refugees. It does not mean it will work well with the South Sudanese refugees. So no one size fits all. Okay, it doesn't apply in the humanitarian cycle. So you must be flexible, because situations keep changing. So the context and type of crisis or emergency determines how implementation would be done. Okay. So the bottom line is that none of the actors work independently. Inclusive actions and responses are more effective, and mostly if putting the affected communities at the center. The state context or politics at play affect the independence of humanitarian situations sometimes, especially if the government is autocratic or doesn't want other actors, if it does not allow other actors to respond. For instance, you've had cases where the Ethiopian government has been accused of limiting some of the humanitarian agencies to provide those to provide its responses, and to get to the people who are suffering. It's process oriented, and of course the need for assessment of humanitarian action calls for evaluation of humanitarian action, and therefore that's what we are going to introduce in our next session, as we look forward to experiencing more knowledge regarding evaluation of humanitarian action. Some key concepts, again, you can find more about this in your research, and here you have some readings that you can take a look. Some of them I've provided them in Moodle. So thank you.